Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas que nos acompanham.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Buenas tardes a todos e todas.
Desculpa, estou com um problema no áudio aqui. Vamos lá então, de novo, gente, desculpa. Boa tarde.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon to everyone. We are now just opening the last debate of the International Seminar on Internet Governance. This is a very current topic, and that's not by chance, as we consider and prepare this seminar built on these debates precisely based on this chronological line regarding both the advances of the Internet since its creation and its governance, which consequently has also been transformed and needs to be in fact. So the idea of this seminar was based in this idea that would restart the beginning of this history as it was created, its process of institutionalization, their challenges as to how it works in terms of infrastructure, until it reached a much closer scenario in the development and use of technology, which presents new and more current challenges. We had a total of 7 meetings, all held online and live, with very high level of experts in our field of internet governance from different countries and regions, and all of them, they had lots of say and came with a recognition of the importance of this proposal to discuss in a propositional why the construction and role of this governance regime today. It was a work that took about 7 months of dedication to get off the paper, but that's not done yet. This is another initiative of the School of Internet Governance, and the idea is that this seminar can be just the beginning of a much larger project that will expand this debate on internet governance, and it will be a pillar of the EGI in its commitment to be the training of actors in these ecosystems, and mainly that this debate may contribute to the construction of new paths capable of corresponding to the many challenges that the advancement of the internet and its application from the web bring us. We are all living a time that is not easy. It's a phase of great transformations, perhaps initially felt more at a social and political level, and that have already been impacting the organizational of life and society, even before we faced a global pandemic. And it's a phase that also, due to these changes, it's accompanied by conflicts and uncertainties, and sometimes even the feeling of social chaos. Is one way or another, the internet is a tool that is increasingly central to everyone's life in society, is linked to these changes when it's not the vector itself. Now, the pandemic came, and I think in a way accelerating this whole process. First, it has made more dependent on the internet with the need for isolation, social distance. Our daily activities and our interaction with others are now necessarily done with the mediation of some kind of digital platform. And I think it expands a little bit the notion of an interconnected society where each organism is connected in such a way that the action of one them reflects on the whole. An event that started on the other side of the world is impacting our lives. And no doubt the pandemic also had expanded the conflict, uncertainty, and chaos, even if in some places more than in others, but it's still affecting all human nature. There is a book from John Donne that opens Hemingway's For whom the bell rings, which incidentally narrates the destruction of the human condition in a war, very metaphorical for the present day. But anyway, the passage says, no man is an isolated island. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the whole. If a cloud is washed out to sea, Europe is diminished. As if it were a promontory, as if it were your friend's house or your own. And make an analogy with the internet, which is also inserted in this nature and also affected at this moment. It is even more important to turn our attention to how this tool has been used and its positive or harmful effects on life in society. Unlike a pandemic, which is after all a nature event and it's somewhat beyond our capabilities to prevent the event from occurring, the internet is a human creation, and for this reason, we have the capacity and the duty to monitor, guide, and even control this creation so that it can bring more positive impacts to people's lives and to live in a society that will be increasingly interconnected. Anyway, sorry for the digression, but all this was just to say that the effort in convincing all these meetings were great and they do not end here. So I'd like to thank all that made the best to make this seminar come true. We have around 10 people in a Zoom room to make everything possible to happen. So on behalf of the EGI team and Professor Glaser, that thanks to his active coordination, who believes in the importance of the initiatives and the importance to foster and leverage knowledge. And today, to talk about the different ways as how technology may get empowered and impact the society throughout the infrastructure of the network, we have a number of speakers, and I would like to thank you deeply to have accepted our invitation and to talk about all these issues. And thank you so much for your time. And before I introduce our moderator, Fernanda, I would like to say the death of any man does not decrease me because I'm part of the mankind, so does not ask for those who bend to yourself. So please stay at home. It's been very hard to everyone, but I believe that is going to go away. So let's be responsible and things will get better soon. Fernanda is a professor at the Institute of Psychology of the University of Rio de Janeiro. She's also a researcher at CNPq and a member founder of the Surveillance Technology and Society Center. She was a guest visitor at the University of Paris and King's College London. She's a current researcher and collaborator at Surveillance Center at Queen's University, Canada, and she has a number of books that have all their titles in Portuguese from publisher Boitempo. She's co-editor at some magazines. Thank you, Fernanda, for being with us today and have a great debate.
Thank you, Luisa. Such an inspiring reading you have just made. Good afternoon, everyone who are here. It's a pleasure to be here, being the moderator of this international conference on internet governance. I would like to start by thanking for the invitation to be here. Let me thank for the School of Internet Governance. I've been part of the discussions that you have been making, and I've been attending most of them. And I would also like to thank everyone who's here supporting us so that this event can come together. After my initial comments, I would like to tell you how glad and how honored I am to be the mediator of this panel. A panel that has people whom I admire deeply, whose work I have been following up for a long time. So, Selena Nemorin and Ulises Mejias, I'm really delighted to be here with you, and it's such an honor to be able to hear you and also open a dialogue with you. Selena Nemorin is professor of the Department of Culture, Communication and Media, the University College London. She has already worked at the London School of Economics and also in the University in Australia. Selena has a number of interesting research, a combination of the topics of education, technology, equity. She's been working with human rights, gender and race equity, policies of faction, and political economy of artificial intelligence. She's also the author of the book Biovigilance and Marketing of New Media, World Discourse and Representation, published in 2018. She's also the author of a recent book, or rather an older book called Everyday Schooling in the Digital Age. Ulises Mejia is Associate Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Global Planning of the University of the State of New York. He is also a researcher of the project of Algorithm Observatory. His research works are focused on Internet critical studies, network science, physiology, sociology of technology, social media. Ulises is the author of a book, and I'm going to refer to it in English, Up the Network, Disturbing the Digital World, published in 2013, and recently co-authored Nick Coudry. They published the intriguing book, The Cost of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating It for Capitalism. Our panel, as Luisa has anticipated, is the last panel of a series of discussions and presentations which started in March. It's the part of the third thematic pillar, platform, power, and surveillance. Luisa has anticipated the topic of our panel today, focusing on internet business models and dystopia of innovation. Our guest speakers were invited to come and to react about platforms, business models, really trying to understand how we are going to deal with the power of new internet services to avoid different monopolies, and what would be the consequences it would have to internet governance. Much is said about digital platform today, and there is this constant metaphor of the ecosystem. It's a metaphor I use myself. I think it's very timely, and it indicates not only the scale of the problem, whenever we are talking about digital platforms or the whole digital culture per se, but it also helps us understand the need to reposition ourselves in terms of cognition, practical, technical, political aspects in the whole context of science and technology. And it's required to do that to build collectively all policies focusing on the common good, as well as creating ways to make us live within this ecosystem that takes into consideration the complexity and the interrelation of all the multiple layers involved in it. The panels that happened before this one throughout the whole program have addressed different aspects of all these multiple layers that are part of the ecosystem. We have heard about infrastructure, we've heard about protocols and technical political implications and governance. And finally, we are here focusing on platforms per se, involving browsers, social media, search engines, clouding, apps, and the whole world with which we constantly deal with, and all the dynamics of production, circulation, and handling of data and content involving people, the algorithm, the interface, machine learning, and a number of other processes. We also know, and it has been repeated a number of times here before, that even though we are constantly speaking about internet, even though we are normally talking about global processes, they are not homogeneous at all, and they are not uniform either. They involve asymmetries, inequalities, and differences that have to be taken into consideration in our action. Concerning business models and platform internets, which are the key topic of this panel, we know how much power is concentrated in few corporations, which are the owners not only of business models and web interface spaces, but also interfere in the social dynamics, all the subjective and political and economic spaces of the web, because these algorithms, which are all present and active in set platforms, really meet the needs of their own agenda. They just influence behaviors as they may seem fit to obtain engagement with their own apps, with their own environments in a closed loop cycle. Something which has been really impovering some dynamics that used to be more focused on the common good, a broader perspective. This phenomenon, which we know to be global, involves concentration of power and also local impact at the same time. And this is why all of us, based in countries such as Brazil or in other Latin American countries or in the so-called global South, we really have to strengthen this discussion. And we have to create a decolonial agenda of thoughts and considerations that may serve as inspiration for further governance models. Right now in Brazil, we are experiencing a very dystopic moment, not only because of the disastrous management of COVID-19 pandemic here in the country by the federal government, but also because of the colonial attitude that the government has been addressing very important strategic databases in areas such as education, labor, and environment. The government has made partnerships with Microsoft and Google, for example, but in a very neglectful way, just to use a term that Beatriz Buzenich proposed in terms of the Argentinian government, and I think it's very much applicable to Brazil as well. These partnerships, which are not very caring, they tend to neglect and leave aside a number of items. Something that I have been observing from my position at Lavitz and the University of Rio de Janeiro. For example, there is a partnership with Microsoft called Mais Brazil, More Brazil. It involves the use of artificial intelligence tools provided by Microsoft to employment and sustainability. For the area of labor, for example, the partnership involves the implementation of artificial intelligence to be the intermediation between people who are looking for jobs and potential job offers. Microsoft is also offering qualification of workers through a worker school in a distance learning platform using tools that, of course, belong to Microsoft. So this set of data, which is one of the largest systems of labor in the world, is a privileged source of information about a huge labor market such as the one in Brazil. And having access to that provides not only knowledge about the formal labor market, a very current snapshot of the reality, and also provides long-term analysis, setting trends about structural changes in the occupation market in Brazil, and at the same time allowing and enabling the influence of public policies and other arenas. So it's just an example. I'm sure it can make you understand that this kind of partnership, which is only based on a colonial understanding, and as such, just a colonialism traditional way, would really harm us as people. And the same has been used for example, clouding infrastructure in Microsoft in Brazil, a creation of a new data center in Rio de Janeiro, and also environmental issues involving the Amazon. So this is one of a number of examples of a transfer of data from the government to these companies to work on data processing. In addition to a very concerning scenario in Brazil, and this is something that extends to other regions of the so-called global south, where we have a number of histories about autonomic technology movements, such as free software or free spectrum movement or creation of community networks, and a history of pioneerism and innovation in creating multi-stakeholder models in the internet, such as the example of CGI here in Brazil, and the whole process that it has embraced to create the internet regulation and framework recently approved. Therefore, our panel really wants to emphasize the importance of having this history of moving towards a technological involvement and more and creation of additional autonomy, independence, bringing on board new stakeholder initiatives and inviting Selena, who has been working with artificial intelligence, digital technology, gender equity, and equity, and Ulises, who has been also working towards these same values with the so-called data colonialism or fighting data colonialism. So I am sure that this panel will be extremely enriching to all of us and to this very important and collective construction that we can all develop. So thank you very much, Selena and Ulises, for being here with us. So I'm going to start by handing it over to Selena Nemorin, and then I will invite Professor Ulises Mejias, and then thirdly, we'll go into our Q&A and discussion session. I'm going to greet everyone who is here with us once again. Thank you very much. And please feel free to send your questions through the chat, and I'll be glad to have them answered when the Q&A session comes. Selena, now with you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. This is a really nice initiative that I'm very happy to be a part of, so thanks again. I have some slides that I thought I would organize to guide me and you through what I'm planning on talking about. So I think I'll just share my screen now, if you don't mind, and we'll see if this works, hopefully. All right. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay. All right. So I'm Selena. Thank you, Fernanda, for the introduction. I'm honored to be here. I thought I would start with saying a little bit about myself in terms of what I'm involved with at the moment, just to give you some context with regards to what I'd like to talk about today. My focus is actually going to be on education, because I've been watching this technological these technological events play out over some years now, and it's cause for concern with regards to the power that social media companies have now. Large platforms such as Amazon and their reach into education, which I'll address later. But these are causes for concern with regards to the integrity of students in schools and their privacy rights and all kinds of rights, digital rights, that are not necessarily being taken into account by these large corporations. So first of all, there are two books, as mentioned before, that I've either authored, sole-authored or co-authored. The first one is Everyday Schooling in the Digital Age. And that's a 3-year ethnography in Australia of secondary schools, 3 secondary schools, to look at the kinds of technology uses in school or sometimes non-use and whether or not these are useful for children or students, learners, teachers, what the implications are for social implications, ethical implications. So that was with Neil Selwyn at Monash University in Victoria, in Australia. And then more recently, I have had my dissertation. This was actually my dissertation, Biosurveillance in New Media Marketing, where I look at the kinds of technologies being used in consumer surveillance, specific to the bringing in of biometric and neurotechnologies to get more information or affective information about consumers, which is then used to develop advertisements that are then fed back to the individual. So it's a loop. They're taking data from consumers and they're feeding back these data that are personal data and very personal data, including the way they think, the way they feel, designing advertisements according to that and pitching it at people. So these two books, but also I'm involved, or PI, Principal Investigator for the Fair AI in Education project, which is a grant that I've just received as of last year. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And CHI, Cyber Hygiene in AI-enabled domestic environments. That's specific to AI, IoT, and social housing. So the project, the Fair AI project for me, it's an attempt to affect equitable technology policy development in education. My focus is looking at public-private partnerships and their initiatives with regards to the use of AI and EdTech in education. So as I mentioned before, I'm looking at Amazon, Microsoft, Twitter, but also World Bank, all kinds of universities and NGOs. I'm thinking critically, hopefully, about the implications that these AI systems or EdTech systems in general might have on teaching and learning. And the context I'm looking at is the African context at the moment. Although I'm based in London, I am keeping an eye out on AI in education in London. My main interest, however, is in Ghana and South Africa, and I'm especially interested in the potential benefits, harms and risks that are associated with these leadership roles that large corporations play when it comes to AI in education. One of the first things that I did when I started my project, it started in September of last year. Because of the pandemic, we've had some delays. Fieldwork has been quite difficult for me. I can't get out of the UK to Ghana, but luckily for me, I have a really fantastic postdoc who's doing some fieldwork for me over there. And we started with discourse analysis. I've always been interested in discourse because I do believe that discourse frames the way we behave in the world, what we think, our values, etc., etc. So what I wanted to do was examine the documents that were publicly available on the internet specific to AI and education, but also AI in society more broadly. And I was curious about how AI was being framed. So I elicited the help of a couple of my colleagues, one from UCL, Andreas Flakidis, and University of Western England, Panos Andriotis, and they're computer scientists. And they helped me design some tools to do name entity recognition in order to understand social, political, economic relationships across the different individuals and groups that we were noticing coming up in the documents related to AI and society, or AI and education. So there are three themes that I have found to represent what I think is recurring in the documents. And there's numerous amounts. I've got 250 now, I think, and it's increasing. So it's a corpus that's growing as the project continues. So the first one is geopolitical dominance through education and technological innovation. And this links to data colonialism, which Ulises will speak about in a moment. The second is the creation and expansion of market niches. And that relates to rationalities of extraction. Again, I'll leave the bulk of that to Ulises, but what I wanted to point out here is that in biosurveillance, that the book that I wrote, it was about how consumer markets or consumer niches are created by personal advertising, by individualization, by catering different kinds of advertisements to fit to someone's existing beliefs. So again, if you think about, I think his name is Eli Parisier, he has this idea of filter bubble, where you're only ever exposed to the things that you already like. So because, for example, Amazon knows what you like, that's constantly what you're going to get. So you don't actually have the possibility to explore anything radically different to that. With regards to putting this in an educational context, the same thing would happen to students. With regards to personalized education, having a machine that is driven by AI, making sense of what a student needs, what a student likes, what a student potentially wants to do with their life, and packaging this up in some kind of curriculum, they're narrowing that particular student's world, their particular niche. So you can call that market niche in as much as it's a behavioral environment that is moderated by the technology that is basically foundational to whichever institution you're talking about, whether it's consumer surveillance, whether it's education. So with regards to rationalities of extraction, there's this idea that there was cheap nature, there's cheap labor, there's cheap data. But it's actually, the point of concern for me is that it's the affective part of the data that we have to be worried about, because it's the bit about how we feel, our emotions, how we respond to different triggers that we see in these multimodal media systems. That is what is being mined and fed back to us. And one of the things that I say in biosurveillance is that they're creating needs that are not already there, and they're shaping the way we behave. I think a very good example of the power of this technology in terms of putting us in these niches can be seen in the US election, where the social media system managed to have quite a large amount of the United States population believing that the election was rigged. So an entirely different kind of understanding to the other half of the United States, or however many people there were. But the point is that these social media companies have the power to change the way we think. And they're doing that by mining emotions, mining affect. Also, the third theme is managing narrative perceptions and norms. One of the things you'll find is that for, as you would know, technologies to be successful and to be taken up in general, they must have trust. People must trust in them. So there's a movement for governments and industry to increase public trust in AI systems. So these are the kinds of things that I've started. These are preliminary findings. These are the things I've started looking at. I've started noticing about AI in education and these platforms. So in general, I'm looking at it from an ecological framework, but also taking into account that there are impacts on the natural environment, as well as issues of intersectionality. So some key issues come up, and I've noticed that these are quite prevalent in education. And I imagine they would be quite prevalent in other domains. They're not in order of priority, so I'll just go through them. The first one is a lack of consensus, and this relates to policy, this one, for AI in education. There's a lack of consensus on what artificial intelligence is. It's difficult then to develop regulations and policies for something that people can't agree on a definition for. So how do we regulate these things? And I've said in several areas that the key is to look at algorithms, to look at the processes that are being enacted in schools, in these systems. But that means opening up opening up the black box. So that is a problem in itself. Another problem is cognitive liberty. And that's something I write about in biosurveillance as well, with regards to the need to have the intellectual freedom to be able to make our own choices without being affected by, for example, Facebook, to believe in a particular thing. We want to be able to make our own decisions. We want to have the autonomy to have the cognitive liberty needed to live and exist in a democratic society and participate autonomously in that, or as autonomously as we can. So key here is behavioral nudging, and you'll see a lot of behavioral economics coming into play when it comes to AI in education or AI in society in general. Behavioral nudging, that's quite a significant thing at the moment that's happening in education. The question is it ethical? As I mentioned before, another key issue is the manufacture of trust. How are they doing this? There's also issues of worsening the digital divide. So one of the biggest issues is access to internet for example, Ghana, which is the first country I'm focusing on at the moment, but across the world, really, we can say this. The digital divide can be exacerbated by artificial intelligence in education, largely because it'll be the people who have the money, who have the power and the money to be able to access these things. Whereas the people who don't have access to these systems will be missing out on a particular kind of education. Now, one of the things I've also noticed is that these policies have particular mechanisms in them that are discriminatory, that don't necessarily, although they should be, but they don't necessarily uphold the primacy of us over technology. So it's a matter of needing to decolonize policy as we go through these understandings or these new systems. There's also exploitation of students, basically, with regards to, as I was saying before, the affective dimension of things, where the data is extracted, but not just student data, but affective data in terms of likes. That's data colonialism, and that's also biosurveillance, because it's biological characteristics that are also being taken from us. And the final issue is algorithmic governance. There's a wish or a desire and a push, actually, for data-driven everything. And when we have data-driven everything, and we have industry, we have corporations feeding mass amounts of data to each other, then what type of society are we living in when these social media companies with governments have power over us with regards to imposing particular technical systems on us, as opposed to people like me saying, well, maybe there's another way, maybe there are other systems. Maybe AI in education is not that necessary. Maybe there are other problems that need to be looked at first. One of my focuses is gender, and it's an issue with regards to women compared to men, especially in the global south and access to internet. But in general, there's an issue with access to internet. As I said before, 19% of people in least developed countries do not have access to internet, and whereas 87% of the population of developed countries do. So there's an issue of a lack of parity here. There's an issue that has to be addressed, an issue of fairness in governance. And that means looking at policies and regulations to prevent discrimination and promote well-being of people over profit, of people over technology companies. So what is power? This is a question that I have asked myself as I read through all the documents that I've been reading through for my project and my research in general. How is it manifested? But more particularly with regards to governance and internet governance, how is it exercised through policy making? And as I've been saying, focusing on the modulation and surveillance of affect in these different settings can help us understand where power sits, but also through understanding these algorithmic mechanisms, we can maybe figure out how to regulate in a way that actually protects our rights as individuals. So I wanted to show a practical example actually with regards to the kinds of things that I was saying about platforms in education. And this is something recent that I've just read about, and it's Amazon. And in December of 2018, Jeff Bezos invested in MindStrong Health. And this is a mobile app designed to track users' mood and cognitive states and identify signs of depression and mental health. In April 2017, the year before, Jeff Bezos invested 190 million of his personal funds into Everfi. Now, Everfi promotes itself as a digital wellness network, and the platform is now seeking entry into education to provide teachers and students with digital courses in life skills and STEM and career readiness. If you note that the other investors, if you go to the website, you'll see that Eric Schmidt, the former executive chairman of Google and Alphabet, are investors, and Evan Williams, Twitter co-founder. So with regards to this particular digital wellness network, this Everfi, it is trying to enter all kinds of educational environments, ranging from K-12 to higher education, and it's relying on accessing a lot of data from the students and the teachers to try and improve education. And one of the aims is to make education just, to make education change. And they're using COVID-19 as a way into this because they're saying that it's necessary more than ever to have a good remote education system. If you have a look at the privacy policy, I've just taken an extract of this. It talks about how Everfi will actually have access to other social media outlets, other platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So it's no longer just one platform on its own. We know that platforms are in ecosystems, they exist in ecosystems. But in the realm of education, it's not just one platform coming in. It's one platform coming in and then connecting to a bunch of other platforms and bringing them into education. So it's important, I think, to scour these privacy policies, to have a look at what these companies are doing. And one point I want to make is that a lot of them will say that because they're linking, like this one, to other companies, if you're being sent to another company, then there's no accountability on the original company. So who's accountable for privacy when there are different network connections and different people being referred to all over the place? Other questions that I ask myself as I read through everything related to platforms in education, related to how big they're getting, related to how much data they're collecting with regards to what they want to do. I mean, algorithms are trained to understand us, right? But do we actually know how they work? In schools, when I was doing the ethnographic project, most of the teachers had no idea how the algorithms worked. They did not know how the privacy policies work. They didn't understand them. Do we understand how the data accumulated? Well, they didn't, but it's important to do that, right? And what happens with the data? How are normative codes being developed, and whose interests do these norms serve? What does fair look like as a practice in the context of internet governance? Who gets to say what fair is? How can governments facilitate the creation of ethical policies for development goals? Now, ethics for me is a huge focus here, because as I've noticed throughout this Fair AI project, is that there's a push for AI ethics, global AI ethics. But if you take a look at the individuals and groups that are participating in this ethics setting agenda, they're primarily from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from the UK, from Europe, from China even, but not necessarily from places that have had experiences as colonized spaces. So there's a lack of representation in that respect. So there is a need for grassroots-driven rules, principles, and values upon which we can evaluate our conduct. If we accept these technologies, there's a need to protect human rights and make sure that policies are addressing this. There's a need to act in the best interest of human beings over profit, of animals, and of the natural environment, responsible innovation and regulation, and the need for decolonizing policy and ethics is foundational for building a more equitable and connected world. So that brings me to the end of my chat here. There's a lot more that I'd really like to say about this entire thing, but I'll leave it for Ulises to pick up on the data colonialism piece. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Selena, por essa fala tão inspiradora. Realmente tem muitos pontos aí para discutir.
Thank you, Selena. Such an inspiring presentation, and there are a number of points that we'll certainly pick up again when it comes to our discussion. So now, Ulises, back to you.
Thank you very much. I will also share my screen if you don't mind, but I did want to start by expressing solidarity with my Brazilian friends. I know you're going through a difficult time because of the pandemic right now, so just know that our thoughts are with you. Thank you to all the organizers for inviting me and for all the hard work that's gone to put together this event. Thank you also for the translators who are working very hard to make sure everyone understands in all three languages. And please excuse me that I will make my presentation in English. It's just the language I'm used to these days in speaking. With that, let me then share my screen. So I'm going to be talking a lot about data colonialism. And it might seem strange to put those two words together, data and colonialism. So the first point I wanted to make is that in some ways, colonialism has always depended on data. I think even whether we think historically or in more recent times, I think there are plenty of examples that illustrate this. For instance, if we think about maps and surveys that colonizers needed to illustrate territories that they were acquiring, or the surveys that they used to collect and manage the data from those territories, clearly all of these things require data. Even if we think about passports, which obviously we all have one these days, but in the context of colonialism, they were very specific tools used to control the movement of people. And of course, to produce passports, again, you needed data from the colonized subjects. If we think about, for instance, plantation spreadsheets, that were used to manage haciendas, to manage plantations in colonial times. Obviously, this was before the days of Microsoft Excel, but you're seeing here to the left an example of a spreadsheet used to manage the slaves in a plantation. This spreadsheet tracks the cost of acquiring and managing the slaves. This was a plantation in the United States. Even if we think in the context of the global pandemic right now, of vaccination cards, which again, in previous pandemics, were important tools in colonies to manage the movement of bodies, particularly of bodies that were seen as threats, that were seen as polluted bodies, and that needed to be separated from the rest of society so that they wouldn't infect the colonizers. So vaccination cards obviously required data. If we think more generally about census data and why it came to be and how it has been used, not just to collect information about our societies, but again, in extreme cases, for instance, the map I have in the background of Johannesburg in 1901, when they were confronting the Spanish flu, and how they used census data to basically create plague colonies, cities outside of the city where you could send the infected bodies, mostly in this case of people of color, of Black people. And lastly, if we think of forensics and policing data in the context of colonialism again, the invention of fingerprints itself was a technology developed by the British in India, and then, of course, exported to the rest of the world, but it has very concrete colonial roots. Or even if we think more recently of phenotype guides, such as the one you see to the right of the screen there, which was a guide used by Soviets in Russia to identify different types of faces. So perhaps a prototype of facial recognition. And as you can see in the image there, it was a guide to identify Jewish people, gypsies, and of course, all sorts of people from Central Asia, Muslims, etc. So my point here is that throughout colonialism, the production of data has been crucial to the practice and the management of the colonies, the practice of colonialism. Now, if data has always been an instrument of colonialism, we could be excused for seeing the colonized as mere victims or subjects of the colonizers' technology. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. For instance, when I think about data colonialism, I tend to think of my own role in this relationship, not as that of a passive subject, but perhaps more like that of a native informant. And here I'm going to use the example of La Malinche, which is a very common example in Mexico. I'm sure in Brazil you have very similar figures. This was a Nahuatl woman. Her name was Malintzin. She was a slave, basically given to Hernán Cortés, the conquistador of Mexico. She served many different important functions. She was an interpreter. She was an advisor. And basically, she was an intermediary between these two worlds, the European one and the indigenous one. So her role was by no means that of a passive colonial subject. She was an active agent playing a very important role. Because of that specific role that she played, of course, in Mexico, she is often seen as a traitor. And of course, there's all sorts of elements of misogyny here, to see this particular woman also in the role of a traitor. But regardless of that, whether we like to admit it or not, she's also seen basically as the mother of the race. In particular, the mother of the mestizos, of these hybrid individuals that we are, the Latinx people. So I want to think a little bit about this role of the native informant that Melintzin was playing, but in the context of our digital era and in the context of data. The native informant actually, if we use this definition provided by Spivak in her important work, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, she defined native informants as a figure, quote, who in ethnography can only provide data to be interpreted by the knowing subject for reading. So native informants are all of us who generated this data, and the data is really important not to us, but to the subjects that can read, in other words, the colonizers. So we are, in fact, informing on ourselves, producing data about ourselves. The colony in this context is our social life, and the metropolis is the platform, like Facebook or Google. Perhaps this does constitute in some ways a betrayal of ourselves in this case, where we are exchanging valuable information about our social lives. What would be gold in ancient times, we're exchanging it for trinkets. So this to imply that our role in this new form of colonialism is not passive at all. We are participants. Now, a lot of these ideas that you're seeing, as we are going to untangle them, I would like to introduce you to the work I've done with Nick Coldry, which is captured in this book that you see here, The Costs of Connection. And so all of these ideas were developed with my co-author, Nick Coldry from the London School of Economics. One of the important points in our argument is that we're actually not using the word colonialism metaphorically. Again, it might seem strange to use that word to refer to what's going on. And perhaps people think, well, you're using it metaphorically, but we're not. We are actually suggesting that what we are facing is a new phase of colonialism, what we call data colonialism. This phase of colonialism basically prepares the ground for a new mode of capitalist production. In the same way, perhaps, that the haciendas, that the plantations financed and prepared the way for the factories in industrial capitalism. The wealth generated during colonialism gave shape to this new emerging form of capitalism. And so we're seeing this process again. We don't know yet what that new form of capitalism is going to look like, but we know that it's coming. Now, this is happening, of course, while coexisting with the neo-colonial legacy. So just because we're talking about a new form of colonialism and perhaps a new form of capitalism, the legacy of colonialism is still very much with us in terms of racism, in terms of sexism, in terms of the targeting of specific populations. That hasn't gone away. That's still very much with us. So basically what we're arguing is that whereas the old colonialism grabbed land, grabbed resources and human labor, the new one grabs us, our social lives, as they become abstracted through the medium of data. So basically data is what takes our social lives and converts them into a medium that can be extracted and that can be used for generating wealth. And this basically represents a potentially global transformation. And this transformation is playing out not just in the global south, but also in the global north. Like colonialism, the historical colonialism, it was also a force that transformed the whole world, not just the south or the north. So let me give you then the official definition of data colonialism, as Nick Coldry and I define it. We say that data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. We're not against data. We're not against collecting and using data. We're specifically talking about a form of data that is used to extract wealth from our social lives, and that it is used to create that wealth. In other words, for profit. Now, one common question we usually confront is, if we are in fact arguing that this is a new form of colonialism, where is the violence? Colonialism was a brutal genocide that resulted in the elimination of 80 to 90% of the population of the Americas, what is now known as the Americas. So do we expect to see the same kind of violence in data colonialism? Well, obviously not. We hope not. So we're not making a one-to-one comparison, saying that historical colonialism and data colonialism are exactly the same. There are important differences. Differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, in terms of the scales and the context of colonialism. Those are not the same. They're unique to each historical period. But we are saying that there is one important similarity, a crucial similarity, and that is the historical function, which is to dispossess, to extract. What historical colonialism and data colonialism share, in other words, is the similarity of this function, to dispossess. So when we were talking about all of these issues in our work, we wanted to name the new colonial powers clearly and specifically. And we didn't want to just say, for instance, internet companies or Silicon Valley. So to be more specific, we came up with the concept of the social quantification sector. This is basically an industry sector that is devoted to the development of the infrastructure required for the kind of extraction that we're talking about. And what this allows us to do is that we can now talk not just about media, but about everything, every aspect of our lives that are now that in interface with data. Whether we're talking about the collection of data for health, for agriculture, for education, as Selena just described, the social quantification sector includes all of those uses. So yes, we are talking about the big players here in the social quantification sector: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and the like. Since this is a new colonial order with two different poles, one in the United States and the other one in China, we also point out the big players in China as well, such as Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi. What's interesting about these big players is that they are not just monopolies, they are also monopsony hybrids. And these are both terms from economics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but basically the difference is that a monopoly is a marketplace characterized, as you know, by the presence of a single seller. A monopsony is characterized by the presence of a single buyer, not a seller, but a buyer. And so in this day and age when we are all producers of media, these big companies are acting as the single buyers of the content that we produce. Now, apart from these big players, we do have a big environment of smaller players of different sizes. So if you think about all the hardware manufacturers, the software manufacturers, the platforms that we talked about, yes, includes Facebook, but also the other ones. The data analytics companies, the data brokerage companies. So it's quite a big sector. It's not just the big ones, including these smaller companies that Selena talked about that have to do with education or with health, and the collection of data related to those fields as well. Okay, let me shift topics a little bit and tell you more about the coloniality of data relations. Because in the book, what we do is we conduct various forms of trans-historical analysis using the colonial past to try to understand what is happening in the present. And we organize these trans-historical comparisons in terms of the game plan used to play strategy video games. That game plan is known as the 4X model. It includes explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And these are the same strategies that you use when you play a video game like the one you see here in the background, which some of you might recognize. It's part of Sid Meier's Civilization series. And this is Colonialism, the video game. In this game, you can play the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch, I believe. And what you have to do to win the game is apply these 4 strategies: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. The natives, of course, and their resources are controlled by the computer. They're not even full sentient players. We don't have time to explore all of those, so let me just focus on one of them. In fact, the one on exploration. And what I want to do here is compare 2 historical documents. The first one is the terms of use of Google Chrome, which are very similar to the same terms of use that Selena was talking about. But this is basically what happens when you install Google Chrome. In case you haven't read the terms of service, let me just quote briefly the section that says that when you install Google Chrome, you give Google, quote, a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display to others through the services. I know, it's a mouthful, but basically, when we install Google Chrome, this is what we are giving permission to Google to do with our data. I want to compare this to another historical document. This document is called the Requerimiento. It was a document read by Spanish conquistadors when they arrived in the New World and they were about to conquer a village or a city. Sometimes they would arrive in the middle of the night under cover of darkness. And they would proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population that did not speak Spanish. The document read in part.
El documento dice parcialmente.
But if you do not submit, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That is the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install there. My point is not to suggest, obviously, that what happened or that what happens after we install Google Chrome is the same thing that happened after the Requerimiento was read. Rather, my point is to call attention to the use of this abstract, incomprehensible language to carry out this initial act of dispossession. Now, the reason this system that I've been describing works so well is because it is based in new rationalities that have very deep roots with old rationalities from our colonial past. Let's start with cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, nature had to be framed as cheap It was said to be abundant. It was said to be free, just there for the taking. From a legal perspective, it was said to be without an owner, at least a civilized owner. That's where the concept of terra nullius comes from, which in Latin means no man's land. The colonizer arrived, saw all of this land, said, great, it's not occupied by anybody, so I can take it. And if it is occupied, those people who live in it are not full human beings. From cheap nature, we move then to cheap labor. And here again, in colonialism, some human beings, and this was mostly determined by race, they were meant to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So the exploitation, the abuse, the genocide, in many cases, that happened with this extraction were framed as social progress. It was said to be for the good of humanity, even for the salvation of the same people that were being exploited. So we can trace a transition from cheap nature to cheap labor, now to cheap data. And as you can see, some of the same extractive rationalities that we saw with nature and with labor are also at play here. Cheap data is said to be abundant. It's said to be free. It's just there for the taking. And it's said to be without an owner, at least in its aggregate form. Yes, you and I produce it individually, but in order to really exploit it and make something useful out of it, it needs processing, like oil, which means it needs advanced technologies that only some corporations have access to. So our job, your job and my job is only to generate it. And we're told that this is what progress looks like. So how do we even begin to resist all of this? And so now to wrap up the last part of the section, I want to talk about a proposal to begin to unthink these rationalities. This proposal is for a non-aligned technology movement, and it is a proposal I'm developing with many people, including Juan Ortiz-Froehler, my colleague from the Tierra Común network. And basically, the question here is, how do we create an activist movement to resist data colonialism? Now, a movement of non-alignment actually has a history. The original non-aligned movement emerged during the Cold War. And this was a way for nations in the global south to basically say, we don't want to go the route of capitalism, nor do we want to go the route of communism. We must find a third way. So with the non-aligned technologies movement, we're trying to identify a similar alternative. We want to be able to say no, on the one hand, to the profit model of Silicon Valley, where anything is allowed as long as it can demonstrate that it can make money. But on the other hand, we also want to reject the model of the Chinese Communist Party, where the point of the system is just to use data to control and to monitor and to exercise power over populations. What might this movement look like? I think we can envision different forms of non-alignment. For instance, in terms of infrastructure, we can imagine non-aligned apps, non-aligned platforms, non-aligned search engines, etc., non-aligned internet service providers. Many of these things already exist. We already have the technology. It's just a question of launching a movement where we can all agree and support each other in using these tools. We can talk perhaps about non-aligned data. What would that look like? What would non-aligned health data look like? What about non-aligned economic data? In the example Fernanda was giving at the beginning of Microsoft and its partnership with the Brazilian government, it's like, well, how could we generate data that is non-aligned with that model of that partnership between these big corporations and the government? Non-aligned environmental data, etc. Could we perhaps imagine non-aligned organizations. Perhaps, yes, eventually get to non-aligned nations. But while we get there, maybe we can think smaller and start smaller, perhaps with non-aligned schools, perhaps non-aligned departments within schools, or perhaps start with cities in the global south, in Brazil and elsewhere that can become non-aligned. And obviously this will result in forms of collective knowledge that are also non-aligned. And this is where we can develop and talk about decolonial theory and practice. We can incorporate what we've learned from technofeminisms. We can develop algorithm observatories, which, as Selena was pointing out, we need them to understand just how these algorithms work and operate. In terms of cultural proposals, maybe even talk about a theater of the oppressed by data, using as inspiration, of course, the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. So just to end my presentation here, I want to talk about the principles of what this non-aligned movement could be, what the principles of decolonizing data could be. And here I want to emphasize that the non-aligned technologies movement is a work in progress. We haven't even agreed on these principles. So these are just the unofficial contributions as I see them from my perspective. But my own take on what these principles could be revolve around strategies that other movements struggling against settler colonialism and environmental destruction have already had success in applying. These include then boycott, divestment, and sanction movements and principles that we can apply in the non-aligned technologies movement. So in terms of boycott, perhaps ways of opting out individually from different platforms. In terms of divestment, perhaps opting out as organizations. And in terms of sanctions, perhaps thinking about ways in which we can nationalize or municipalize our data. Now, these strategies of BDS, as they're known, need to be supplemented, I think, with other strategies that broaden or enlarge the scope of the activism. So I think these strategies also need to be supplemented with knowledge, culture, and solidarity. In terms of knowledge, we need to rely on one of the most powerful weapons in the decolonial struggle. And that weapon is imagination. Because when colonialism couldn't be resisted with bodies, it could always be resisted with minds. So I think knowledge and imagination are a crucial part of this equation. We can apply that knowledge to create culture, to figure out basically what tools of data colonialism we can appropriate and reimagine, and what tools we need to reject. Like Audre Lorde asked, can the master's tools be used to dismantle the master's house? I think the answer is yes, to a certain extent. But figuring out the limits and the ways in which we need to abandon the master's tools, I think that is basically, in essence, the creation of culture. And finally, I think we need to act globally. We need to establish connections with other non-aligned parties that respect our diversity and our difference, but that unite us at the end of the day against our common enemies. So perhaps there's something useful in this old cliche of acting globally, acting both locally and globally. Decolonizing data needs to be a cultural project that is at once aligned with our community's goals of freedom and justice, but also aligned against the goals of extractivist corporations and states. Aligned, in other words, with the non-aligned across the world. Thank you very much. I will end there.
obrigada, Ulises, por essa ótima fala. Vou
Thank you.
iniciar nossa sessão de debate.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Ulises Mejias. We are getting some questions from our audience, so please keep sending questions through our chat, and I will read them to our speakers.
Algumas questões, né? Algumas delas, né? Eu vou começar com uma questão.
I have here, I will start with a question addressing education.
Conversa, tema com o qual a Selena trabalha mais diretamente.
Which has to do more directly to what Selena does, but Ulises, you are invited, of course, to react to this question, and the same applies vice versa, because our next question will address data colonialism, and then maybe Selena may also elaborate if she feels like. So now let's ask to both of you, and going back to education as a main topic. And in Brazil, we have a number of similarities between Brazil and South Africa. And if we consider Latin America as a whole, and the presence of those large technology corporations being present in the educational field. And my question has to do with the dependency level on one hand that those platforms they create in the public and private education setting. And if you could elaborate, Selena, a bit more, as you have a field work in South Africa or in Africa, in addition to knowledge extraction about affection, cognitive and psychological status, and the learning, students' learning process, which is so important. And I'm going to go back to that. In addition to that knowledge extraction that somehow can feed teaching and learning strategies, do you also see what we ourselves perceive, that is the creation, or I mean, we end up depending on those tools which are created by those large platforms, private and public sector, both, not only in terms of skills or ability, but because if we have a state or a nation which mitigates and reduces investments in education, such as the case in Brazil, there is a massive migration of universities which were outside the platforms, but now they are massively back adopting platforms as part of their daily institutional activities. And in Brazil, we have a project called surveillance education, and the state education state mechanisms and the lack of investments are increasing that use in regard to that platforms. Do you also see that in your own field in relation to some other domains? And
mais detalhes, quer dizer, como que você consegue, em termos metodológicos,
and how can you, from a methodological standpoint, how can you research about cognitive, affected, emotional feelings, aspects from your students. Once we all know that those platforms, they are closed in relation to their data extraction and production of data mining.
That's a very interesting question. So let me see if I've understood your questions correctly. The first one is a dependency, that you're asking about dependency on these platforms. And the other second, well, there are a few questions there, but the other one relates to how do we study these systems. Am I correct to assume that these are the two primary questions? Yes? Okay, so I'll talk about the dependence piece. I can speak specifically with regards to AI at the moment, but because there's a global discourse that AI is going to change everything. When it comes to education, you even have UNESCO talking about how AI will transform teaching and learning. The problem here is that a lot of this hype is based on decontextualized information. So there's not really sufficient studies in, educational areas, educational sectors that look at, the real world impacts that AI could potentially have on education. With regards to COVID, though, that has kind of opened up education to large platforms to just swoop in and say, well, hey, we have these systems that we're using for example, I'm going to use Amazon again, for selling. It works really well. We're going to try and move this into education because we have the infrastructure, we've got all the skills there. We have the networks, we have the resources, we have all the people we need to get in place. We have other investors. We know all these people in the social platform ecosystem like Facebook and Twitter, they can all join. And they're using this crisis as a way into education. And what happens, and this was prevalent and obvious in the ethnography I did in Australia, is that as schools, whether they're K-12 or higher ed, get used to a system, they become dependent on it. And when the system goes down, for example, nobody knows what to do. So, for example, the ethnography I spoke about, the school I was responsible for when it came to research, I was an ethnographer there. And the first week I was there, the internet went down. And because all of the teachers had done everything online, all their presentations were online, they were relying on their systems to give them information about who was there at school. Nobody knew what to do. The students were happy because there was no school. There were no resources to teach the students. But the teachers, one of them didn't even remember that you could connect a computer to a printer with a USB cable. And there was also another thing that shows the implications of this reliance on these platforms and these systems is that they had put all of their information online, and there was an emergency fire drill one day when the internet went down. Nobody knew which children were present because all of that information, all that data was online. People were not putting it in a hard copy anymore. So if it was a real fire emergency, nobody would know where the children were, if they're alive, if they're stuck in a building. That's just a practical example of the reliance on these platforms. When it comes to the ones that are happening now, post-pandemic, with regards to Amazon, I'm going on about Amazon, aren't I? But Amazon wanting to go into these higher education institutions and K-12 institutions with their mental health and wellness apps that track, students' mental health, track their dispositions, but track their skills, track what they're studying, track how many hours they're spending on these things. looking at their eyeballs, who knows what they're going to do. But Amazon has the capacity to put all of these things into schools. And once you get in there and the schools and the teachers are giving over authority to these systems to tell them how to teach, to give them, snapshots about their students, that is a very strange dependence on a system that may not necessarily be acting in your best interests. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that properly, but there is that dependency when technology goes into institutions. Whether or not that's going to happen in Ghana, for example, I'm not sure yet. We're still looking at what's happening on the ground with regards to different initiatives. I know that Google is in Accra. There is, I believe it's Accra. Twitter's just announced their headquarters in Ghana. Microsoft is in there. So it's a matter of going into schools, I think, which is what I'll be doing, and seeing the kinds of systems that are being used and how they're being used with regards to methodologies to look at how affect is captured. You can do that by looking at what they're collecting, and you can observe how this happens. And a lot of the time, it's going to be very similar to Facebook in terms of what it looks like, because children like using Facebook. There's already an app that's a platform that is very popular across the world called Schoology. I think that's how you pronounce it, SCHOOLOGY. It looks like Facebook, but it collects an incredible amount of data. So to study that, observations, ethnographies, interviews, focus groups, talk, that's the only way to do it. Unless Ulises has another addition to that.
Not really. I think Selena, she's the expert and she did a great job answering that question.
Ótimo. Obrigada, Selena.
Thank you, Selena.
Retomando o tema do colonialismo.
Now let's go back to data colonialism. Let's talk about the legacy and the new data colonialism and trying to get the Latin America taste of it.
O processo de extração, exploração de terras e de recursos, de
exploitation of data and labor, cheap labor, slavery, everything is intrinsically related with data colonialism and with AI in general. Especially in Global South, these three elements of land, resource, and labor exploitation plus data exploitation are all playing a common role, so to speak. When we analyze data extraction, they seem to be more globally distributed. Even though we know there are inequalities, sad inequalities do not seem to be so evident when we compare that to labor exploitation, which we know that it's huge, because for data colonialism and data capitalism, we know how much of labor has been exploited. And the same concern resources, use of resources, exploitation of ore towards producing that. So I really wonder what's new, what's old, and how it has been redistributed depending on where we are, Global South or Global North.
Thank you, Fernanda. My Portuguese is not very good, but I was looking at the chat and I know there's a similar question from Rafael Evangelista, which is basically this question of, in this new order of data colonialism, are there players, actors, people who are more and less colonized? I think that's in essence Fernanda, what you are also asking. And I think to begin to answer that question, we need to recognize that colonialism was in some ways an evenly distributed project, in the sense that the wealth wasn't distributed evenly. Obviously, one part of the world and one set of people became very rich, while the other majority were underdeveloped. But what I mean by a distributed project is that those relationships, the relationships of colonialism, existed throughout the world. In other words, as people have pointed out, the global South after colonialism was in the global North, and the North was in the South. Thanks to migration, people from the global South started to move and live in the North, in the center of the empire. And thanks to all of these management techniques that we also talked about, the North was also in the South. So those boundaries, I think, sort of become more porous and more difficult to demarcate clearly. I think you are right that in some ways the resources are different. If we were previously talking about land and then about labor, data is a very different resource. And I don't believe the cliche that data is just like the new oil. Obviously, it is very different than oil. It's not just a substance like oil. Maybe the processes of extraction can appear similar, but I don't think it serves as well to equate data to just land or labor. But I think, as I said in the presentation, the function of these very different kinds of colonialism is the same, and it is about the extraction. Maybe today we don't have the appropriation of land like we did in the old colonialism. But today what we have is precision agriculture. That is a way to datafy the land. And through algorithms, through robotics, we have an emergent field, which I would say it's part of the social quantification sector, of not just producing food, but producing data about how that food is being produced. And I think the repercussions of this will be very clear. We have heard the phrase, which I know you have it in Portuguese too, from farm to table, to really encompass the whole production process of food. Imagine what that process will look like when Amazon is in charge of that chain from beginning to end, when they provide the algorithms and the artificial intelligence and the data centers to capture all the information about how our food is grown and how it is then processed, how it is sold in supermarkets owned by Amazon, which we already have in the United States, Whole Foods, to then how that food ends up being in our refrigerators, which are smart refrigerators equipped with Alexa, which can tell us, and can track how that food is being consumed. So again, from farm to table, we will have that whole process owned by one of these big corporations, Amazon or Google, perhaps. In terms of labor, you already pointed out at the beginning of this talk the ways in which labor is being datafied. And it's being measured, and through partnerships, for example, between Microsoft and the Brazilian government, how that data is becoming a source of wealth. So yes, I know I'm again speaking too much, but to go back to this question of, are we all colonized the same way? No. And the same differences that mattered 500 years ago and 200 years ago continue to matter today, in terms of racial differences, in terms of gender, in terms of class. Some people in data colonialism are paying a heavier price, and those people are the same populations that were discriminated against and oppressed during historical colonialism. So in a way, yes, we're all being colonized. Maybe some of us are being more agentic. Some of us are more native informants. But some segments of the population continue to pay a heavier price. So in that sense, I think colonialism is not evenly distributed.
Selena?
Selena, a question to you. Oh, would you like to make a comment?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I was going to add to what Ulises said with regards to the question that Fernanda asked me before about methodology. I should have actually said this because it's obvious that data colonialism is the perfect framework to examine these new things. As well, I'm also having a look at the chat, and it is necessary to have an interdisciplinary, I think, approach to this, with not just the humanities and the social sciences, but also the computer scientists. So that I'm not taking up too much time, because I see that we've got only a few minutes left. Biopolitics as well, and Mbembe's work in terms of making sense of the ideologies that are leaking into or seeping into society through these technologies. I think it's useful to look at that as well. Again, I think it's important to look at the psychosocial and how these technologies not just have material effects, but also they have very psychosocial effects. So, the mind is almost being colonized here. So I don't know if this is too much, Ulises, or too much of a stretch, but can we say the mind is land now? Can we say our mind is the space that's being colonized?
Yes, for sure. And again, this is not a new concept. Theorists of colonialism have been talking about this for a long time. And in fact, I'm thinking specifically of the work of Ashish Nandy, an Indian writer, an intellectual, who wrote a book called The Intimate Enemy. The idea that colonialism became something embedded in our brains. How much more intimate than that can a process be? So I think it is for sure something that happens in the mind. But as I said in my presentation, hopefully that also means that this new form of colonialism is something that can also be resisted with the mind.
Agora eu vou colocar algumas questões.
Now let me ask some questions that were sent by the participants. Ulises has anticipated Rafael's question, but before Rafael, Helena Martins had asked about imperialism. Imperialism and colonialism. Quite similarly to what Ulises has just said, but let me ask a question anyway. She says the following. In fact, our knowledge is getting appropriated by the platforms. Extraction, is it different in different countries? Data extraction is different in different countries. We've already talked about that. But I think about imperialism. Corporations come from the global north. Data comes from the south. And we see that when we consider the uses of social media. So this is one first consideration. And the second issue concerning that Rafael asked was to Selena. And I'm going to read it. As fair artificial intelligence do not run the risk of going into the simple talk of big tech, such as an argument that would mean they are part of ethical exploitation. And then I'm going to ask you to be brief in your answers so that we can really ask more questions from the audience.
Should I just briefly mention about the point on imperialism, which I think is a good point. Perhaps it's a question of semantics, the difference between colonialism and imperialism. To me personally, basically, I think the difference is in terms of the intensity and the scale of time. I think right now we're still at the beginning of this phenomenon that we're calling data colonialism, and hopefully we can still do something about it. If we allowed it to continue, then I would expect that we would see a more imperialistic order take over the world, which, like I said, perhaps the United States and China occupying those two central poles, but hopefully we won't get there. Selena, I think the other question was for you.
Thank you. Yes, is fair AI even a thing? Is it possible? There was a leaked document recently. Well, today I saw this from the EU saying that it's high risk. AI in education assessing students is high risk. So then, if AI is being put into education, when we think about fairness, who's benefiting from this? Who is not benefiting from this? Who's being left behind? And it will tend to be historically marginalized populations who are left behind, largely because they don't have the money to access the things they need to access, but also they're easy pickings. And it tends to be, with the language of inclusion and all of this, there's a real focus on looking at marginalized groups and getting data on that. So the answer, the idea of fair AI, I'm not sure that is a thing yet. And that I think that will come from grassroots work. And I'm very curious about this about non-alignment and how that would fit into fair AI, or the fairness of AI in education and fairness of AI in society in general.
Obrigada, Selena e Ulises.
Thank you, Selena and Ulises. We have here a question from Victor Arnaud, and I will read the question. And the question is, do you think technologies like Mastodon, could that be a first attempt to those non-alignment type of technologies that Ulises mentioned?
Yes, I think so. And I'm a big supporter of open source technologies and the appropriation of technologies, even the use of technologies against their original intention. So I'm not against, for instance, activists using Facebook, even though I'm against Facebook, but at some points I recognize that for tactical purposes, that's what we have to do. The one issue I would say, Victor, is I think with open source and other solutions like Mastodon, we do need to look a little bit broader and larger, because at the end of the day, open source can also be used for the same extractive purposes. I mean, as a matter of fact, most of the web today runs on open source software, and companies like IBM, like Google, actively develop open source software. The Android operating system that I have on my phone is supposedly open source. My point is that we do need to continue to develop these kinds of solutions, but also be critical about the way in which they can be used for the same purposes of data colonialism.
Selena, você quer acrescentar alguma
Would you like to add anything, Selena?
I think I'm fine. I'll leave this one with Ulises. Thank you.
Ok. Bom, a próxima e longa questão é do...
Well, we have one next long question. It's from a professor from the Federal University of the State of Minas Gerais. It's a question to Ulises. And he says, I would like to ask Ulises a question. I consider your book with Nick Codry a great contribution to think about this contemporary world and the new ways of assumed capitalism. In my perception, the notion of surveillance capitalism according or offered by Shoshana Zuboff, introducing that vision, that perspective from the global south. I would like them to ask you about that thesis which you advocate for in your book, that new data colonialism, different from the historical one, would not be violent. It might be interesting to relate that central idea of data colonialism, the idea of extraction, with Mbembe's reading, the philosopher from the Cameroon Islands region, of contemporary necropolitics and the process of becoming black of the world. In short, my question is,
o colonialismo de dados pode ser intimamente relacionado à necropolítica?
Would data colonialism be closely related to necropolitics, as well as plantation and modern slavery constitute the other side of European liberalism?
Yes, thank you, Marco Antonio, for that question. And I think you're right. I do want to be clear that the reason Nick and I try to be very careful about our argument about violence is not to suggest that there is no violence in data colonialism. Clearly there is. However, we try to be careful because when we use that word colonialism, which has, as you know, a very specific history, we do not want to equate the kind of violence that we're seeing right now with a genocide that, like I said earlier, resulted in the elimination of 90% of the population of this continent. So we don't want to make that equation to say this is just like that genocide. That's why we're careful. But you are right that there is necropolitics very much at work here. I think data colonialism is violent in two very different levels. At the symbolic level, as we said, even as Selena pointed out, data colonialism colonizes the mind. And so that is a form of violence in the sense that as we colonize young minds, they may not be able to think of alternatives, to think of a reality that is different. That is, of course, very much a form of violence. But there is also very much a form of physical violence that hasn't gone away. And I'll just give you a quick example, which is speaking of algorithms and artificial intelligence, the recent example of an algorithm in the United States used by hospitals and insurance companies. And this algorithm basically determined whether patients got further care, medical care, if they got extra care. And the algorithm was actually found to be racist and to favor white people, to recommend extra medical care for white people and not recommend extra care for Black people. This is an algorithm that was used by millions of people, and millions of Black people in the United States were impacted by it. That's a very clear form of physical violence in this new emergent order of data colonialism. So that violence has not gone away, and it is the same populations that were paying a heavy price in the old colonialism that continue to pay it today.
Selena?
How about you, Selena? Would you like to add anything to Ulises?
Just to reiterate, the violence is psychosocial violence. It's violence up here for me, harm, with regards to tampering with the way we feel about things, with the way we think about things, changing the way we behave. That is violence. That is an absolute incursion into my integrity as a person. So that is how I see it as violent, amongst other things, but that is primarily the problem for me, that kind of psychosocial violence.
Bem, nós já estamos chegando perto do final do...
Well, we are about to reach our time, so I'm going to suggest one last round, and then I will give the floor back to each one of you for your final remarks, if you would like to make any final comments. But I'd like to say something to be provocative, and maybe I could hear your thoughts about what you have already mentioned in your presentation, which is which sort of resistance and subversion could we consider from being from a data colonialism or from a different dimension, which is the mental and subjective individual colonialism that we are all suffering from.
E aí vocês podem também fazer o encerramento.
And then you may close, you may, go to your final
Selena, do you want to start?
Remarks.
How about you go, Ulises?
Well, yes, I mean, I think there are ways to resist. And I think just like colonialism, it was a very complex problem. Data colonialism is as well, because it's compounded, it's built on top of the old colonialism. So there's no easy solution. I think solutions are going to have to be come from different directions, different channels. I think opting out of platforms, I'm not going to use Facebook anymore, is not going to be enough. I think it's a good starting point, but it's not going to be enough. I think putting pressure on governments is crucial to regulate these corporations. But again, it's not going to be enough. I think basically we need to find ways of decolonizing our lives, decolonizing time and space. The time that we spend in front of screens, there might not be anything wrong with that per se, especially in this day and age when we can't see each other in real life. But let's remember that behind the screen, there's a whole infrastructure extracting and collecting data from us. So we need to decolonize that time spent with these technologies and decolonize the space too. The space that has been infiltrated by surveillance cameras or even by digital devices in our homes, in our kitchens, in our bedrooms. I think we need to decolonize that. And for that, I think we need a cultural movement. We need to use our imaginations, because this is not just a technological problem, it's not just a political problem or an economic problem. I think it's a cultural problem in essence. And thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you today.
Selena?
So, okay, I'm unmuted. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Ulises said in terms of initiatives extending across the world. I think it was amazing for me to come to this event and listen to what others have to say and to realize that there are similar thoughts on my side of the world. And I think it's necessary to reach out across communities from one side of the world to the other and engage in more of these kinds of things, engage in understanding how to theorize these phenomena, how to develop policies, what you're doing now, and just to talk, just have a space to talk about our ideas and feel like there are others feeling the same way. And I think that's also important. as something that is a display of solidarity, so that there are so many of us out there. We just need to connect to each other and start a conversation as a larger group. That's all I have to say, but thank you for having me here.
Obrigada, Selena e Ulises.
Thank you, Selena and Ulises, once again, for this wonderful panel. It was very effective, provocative, controversial, I guess. And if it's not an advantage, it's not positive, but if there is anything positive to take out of the colonialism that we had lived in the past, if on one hand there is a long history of domination, oppression, that is also a history of an ability to reinvent ourselves from a disaster, from being ruined. And once we take that back to the technology field, and such an image, which is not a metaphor, as Ulises said, but here we are talking about real process, but that works as a thinking tool, a illustration which helps us to find some other further resistance tools. And the colonial perspectives, they help us to go further ahead in that direction. So once again, to both of you, thanks a lot. And our School of Internet Governance, with this panel, with these distinguished guests, helps to foster our imagination, our political, technological, socio-technical creation and imagination to work. We all got inspired to collectively find a way out. As you said, those new pathways are not easy to be found. There is no magic recipe. There is no one-size-fits-all. What we need is like a number of tools and different tactics, and that has to be perceived in our daily activities at several spheres, subjectively, and together with the politicians. And being here debating as we are, that's key. It's not enough, I understand, but it is necessary. At least we are doing something, and we are developing and advancing towards some future alliances that will help us to surpass all challenges that we have just addressed in this panel. Once again, thank you to you both, to our audience, and to our Nick.br CGI staff team, the governance team. I don't know if Luisa, our hostess, would like to make any official closing of this international seminar. Well, Fernanda, I just would like to reinforce everything else you said, and thank you all for your participation. And after 7 very fruitful days of debate, I am sure that we are closing this seminar with a very important debate session. And this is so important to see what sort of future we want to our future generations. And thanks to our dear international guests who enriched our seminar. Thank you. And thanks to our attendees, of course.